Thank you, Ross, and good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be here with you all this evening, and it's an honour to be debating with such a fine group of people on both sides of this House. I've long taken pride in my own cross-party allegiances. I firmly believe we all have more in common than what divides us. And I'm pleased to see some familiar faces this evening. And I'm even pleased to see Neil Findlay. I enjoyed hearing his words, even if he's disinterested in mine. I'm only sorry that we're not together in Aberdeen for this occasion. Instead, you'll have to put up with my intermittent Highland broadband, for I too am a victim of the botched R100 rollout. I am proud to call Scotland my home. I'm proud to live in a pluralist country where multiple identities are celebrated. I'm a Highlander, I am Scottish, I am Irish, I am British, I am European. And like so many this evening, I'm also a child of devolution, only slightly older than the Scottish Parliament itself. So it pains me that over 2 decades on from that ambitious move to bring power closer to the people, that the Scottish Government is now letting us down as badly as it is. Power is not closer to the people in Scotland, it has moved further away. Today, we live in one of the most centralised countries in the world, under a Scottish Government that is driven more by the desire for division than it is for evidence-based policymaking. My rural constituency has been ravaged of jobs and economic prosperity by a government hell-bent on moving public services further and further away from the people that they are meant to serve. Many policies are increasingly unworkable in rural areas, and indeed many rural people feel that their voices are not being heard. A laundry list of failures characterise the Scottish Government nationally: chronically underfunded local authorities, the delayed R100 broadband rollout, land hegemony, an appalling record on drug deaths, fuel poverty rife across Scotland, hospitals that sit empty, a bridge that cannot handle icy weather, the lack of support for BIFAB, and a complete inability to get a handle on the chronic housing shortage in our country, to name just a few. Yes, Emma, take your point of information.
Thank you. Yeah, just to pick up on your point about hospitals lying empty, I wonder if you think it would have been more competent to not build the hospital in the first place?
I think it would have been more competent to build one that was in budget and had been opened, not 9 years late. Thank you for that. So one of the most stunning failures, I believe, under the Scottish Government has been education, where standards have plummeted under Curriculum for Excellence. And indeed, in 2015, Nicola Sturgeon told us to judge her on her education record. And I would love to, but she won't release the data to allow us to do so. So according to the judgment of Audit Scotland this week, the Scottish Government's performance on education is limited and falls short. The First Minister said she would close the poverty-related attainment gap completely, but that was 6 years ago. And at this rate, it will take us 35 years to have equity in Scotland. Let me also turn to healthcare. Under the legal treatment time guarantee was breached a further 37,230 times between March and December 2020. And before that, before the pandemic, it was being broken 6,000 times a month. So I'm not sure why people would argue that that's been a success. In my post bag, I receive emails from those who are waiting years for mental health support, including children, people surviving on one lung, people who have received cancer diagnoses too late. And ultimately, and most heartbreaking, I receive emails from those who have lost their loved ones due to an underfunded healthcare and social care system. How anyone could prioritise a referendum over fixing this fully devolved system is truly beyond me. The needle-sharp focus on recovery that Scotland needs and deserves is lacking. Instead, we are stuck between a rock and a hard place, between two governments that have both been in power for too long, two governments that prioritise peddling nationalism, whether red, white and blue or blue and white. As the saying goes, you cannot eat a flag. Neither of these governments are standing up for Scotland's interests, for its needs, or for the priorities of those who matter most, the Scottish people. The binary choice that the SNP and the Conservatives have set up for us this evening is an utterly false one. We deserve much better. To conclude, let me say this to my colleagues on the other side of the House. A government success by simply pointing to the failures of another, as happens so often in this country. We must hold ourselves and our government in Scotland to a higher, more ambitious standard, rather than comparing ourselves to a British government that is also failing. It's not only unproductive, it's negligent. By going down that road, we find ourselves in a race to the bottom, and Scotland cannot afford to be dragged down any further. The SNP might have a slick PR machine, but it has failed the people of Scotland. Thank you.
So for Molly, how do you think that we can keep areas like Aberdeenshire and the Highlands and Islands accessible for young people, for example, with jobs and transport?
That's a big question. I don't want to go on for too long, but I think the top lines of it is, one, we need a really, really holistic approach to this. There's not one simple fix. And, you know, there's talk of depopulation and repopulation. Well, firstly, I'd like to stem the depopulation before we even think about repopulating and bringing more people in. So, you know, for example, the Scottish government a specific type of visa for people who will come and live in the Highlands and Islands. And I would argue that that's not the right approach at all. Of course, we want to welcome as many people in as possible, but right now we don't have the housing, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the broadband connectivity, we don't have the transport connectivity. And the fact of the matter is that people in this area, young people, are having to travel away and move away to have jobs in places like the Central Belt and further afield. And that's obviously a very unsustainable situation. And if we look at the depopulation statistics that we're expecting in the next 20 years, it's devastating. Is like Caithness and Sutherland. And so I would argue that the Scottish Government has a real role to play here in investing in things like renewables, but investing in a way that provides benefit to the community. And I think that's a point that Neil has made as well, is that, you know, we've got people in the Highlands and Islands living in sight of wind farms, and they're in fuel poverty because the way that our energy system works is not working for local people and host communities. So that, I think that is a real key piece of the problem. Building things like affordable housing, tackling second homes, where in some communities they are just running rife, and we're approaching, almost empty villages in parts of the Highlands and Islands because so many of them have been bought up by people who do not live in the community. This is really important. So I think land reform has to come into it. Local taxation changes have to come into it as well. We mentioned business rates, but I think also some sort of land value tax would be helpful, and taxing second homes properly would also be useful. So there's a number of different things, there's a number of different avenues, but ultimately I think it comes down to housing, investing in jobs, investing in local services, removing centralisation has been really, really damaging, and making sure that things like broadband connectivity and transport connectivity are, sustainable for the future.